Hello and welcome back. This is Transport Day at COP today. So the next session is going to talk about making it easy to move around in a sustainable way. And to lead that conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Giles Whittle, who is a World Affairs Editor at Tortoise Media. Please join me in welcoming Giles and his speakers all together at the same time.
Hello. Is my mic live? That feels pretty live. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for being here, for sticking around if you're here for the last session. So, yes, the title of the session is, my name's Giles Whittle, by the way, yes, as was explained. The title is Making It Easy, Sustainable Mobility in the 21st Century. It may not be easy, but we'll try and find a way of making it easy over the course of 45 minutes, which is going to fly by. Let's just remind ourselves briefly of the context. Today is Transport Day at COP. A quarter, roughly, of global carbon emissions come from transport. So do clouds of particulates wherever it's gathered together in one place. Today also is a day of a declaration that I think the host government hoped would lead the headlines, setting a new firm deadline of 2040 for phasing out petrol and diesel, but 4 of the world's 5 biggest motor manufacturers haven't signed it. A lot of countries haven't either. They include the US, China, Japan, and Germany. One thing they all have in common is they make a lot of cars. So that's why I said at the top, maybe this isn't easy, but we'll do our best to sketch out some ways of showing how it could be easier. I think what we'll do, so as not to waste any more time, is come straight to the first of our guests, and I'll introduce them as we come to them, and we'll try and keep 10 minutes at least for questions from the audience at the end. So let me come first to Antonina Scheer. Antonina, you are a researcher at the Grantham Institute's Transition Pathway Initiative at the LSE. And if I understand it right, you basically tell institutions, corporations, whether their strategies, their transport strategies, or their strategies more broadly defined, are aligned with 1.5 degrees. Just tell us briefly how you do that and whether they are.
Sure, yeah, no, it's a great question. What we do at the Transition Pathway Initiative is we take modeling from the International Energy Agency. They provide carbon budgets for different sectors. So for example, they have a carbon budget for the aviation sector. And there are a few different scenarios that they have. The one that's most interesting, and we're just about to start publishing those, is the 1.5 degree scenario. We also have a below 2 degrees scenario, and then one which incorporates the emissions targets of governments so far. And so there's these emission budgets, and the IEA also provides consistent activity projections. So we have a projection of how much flying there will be in 2050 in revenue passenger kilometers. So what we do is we take the ratio of these modeling results, and that gives us, in 2050, this is the emissions intensity of aviation to be aligned. And then to determine whether an airline is aligned, we compare its targets. So we actually don't look in depth into their strategies yet, but we're hoping to expand our work.
So you take them at their word, broadly speaking?
Yes, we take publicly disclosed targets and compare those to the benchmark. And so if they're below 1.5 in 2050, we would mark them as aligned. So it's basically a test of ambition. That's the starting point. Just to give the example of aviation, almost none are aligned with any of the benchmarks, even the very unambitious one. So, and one of the reasons for this is that we don't accept net targets that include offsets, that include an unspecified amount of targets of offsets specifically, because to be consistent with the benchmarks, you can't rely excessively on offsets. We can come back to offsets. There's a whole lot to say about that, but basically, yeah, that's kind of what we see.
And briefly, thank you. I mean, in a sense, it's no surprise that none of your aviation subjects are aligned, but can you give us any examples of terrestrial organizations that run transport networks? How are they doing?
Yeah, I would love if we had a methodology for rail, because rail is really the long-distance transport of the future, but we don't have a methodology for rail. We assess shipping companies, so that's not so much for passengers, but for freight. And in the shipping sector, there is some alignment. There's more alignment than in aviation. Shipping is interesting because companies are very large. The ones we assess are the largest ones, and they have economies of scale. So their intensities tend to be fairly low, even without ambitious targets. But they still need to make drastic reductions to be aligned, and a few of them are starting to be.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, let's be clear. No one's aligned right now. This is an assessment of ambition, and we're taking them at their words. But as we've all heard, estimates of the current rate of warming are still, even fairly optimistic readings, north of 2%. Sitting next to me is Will Butler Adams, who is the man behind Brompton bicycles. Did you actually design them?
Not guilty.
Not guilty.
But I have been fiddling around with them for about 20 years.
Right. Now, would it be fair to say that you regard the solution to the kind of problem that Antonina's working on as lying in plain sight?
I'm not sure I'm going to pedal to China, because I think it would take me rather a long time. So I think the aircraft industry has a really important role to play for how we live on this planet, and it's probably the hardest nut to crack. And that will take a lot of innovation, and it'll take a lot of investment. But ironically, on the flip side, most of us in the world either live in or are going to live in cities. That is where the intensity of consumerism, of transport, of all the emissions in the world are congregated in cities. And yet, ironically, the product that's the most efficient mode of transport that was designed 150 years ago was sort of forgotten. And we're trying to come up with these amazing new, brilliant innovations. One of them is a 2,000 kilo electric vehicle, but we have a 10 kilo vehicle that can do the same job and travel the 5 or 6 miles that most people travel when they move around in a city. And we also come up with amazing innovations like digging tunnels under the ground, deeper than all the other tunnels we've dug, to move people across the city. But actually, we have a little bicycle that can do the same job, and the infrastructure cost is much less. And it has the added benefit of giving you a bit of exercise and affecting your mental and physical health, which is also a chronic problem that we are facing as a society. So I spent 20 years traveling the world on my little bicycle, seeing how different cities deal with these challenges, from the best examples to some of the worst. But the challenges we face in the world from an urbanization perspective are ones that I think much of the solution is there. It will be accelerated with innovation, with electric bikes, with new ways of working, remote working, with fantastic architecture. But we shouldn't wait to use innovations as an excuse not to get a flipping move on and do some of this stuff. The biggest challenge for climate change is leadership. It is people getting on and doing stuff and being prepared to upset a few people, because we can't have consensus. There isn't time for that. It's leadership. We don't need tons more research. It's blindingly bloody obvious. We need to get on with it. And in so many cases, when you have leadership, when you implement change, when you do the stuff that is good for society, 5 years later, everybody loves it. But it takes leadership to get on and do it. And so, for me, from what I've seen, I think there is so much we can do so quickly which will have a positive effect. It's not the solution, because there are some big challenges, but it is there, and we shouldn't wait.
A lot of people agree. Very briefly, looking globally, where is the leadership and where isn't the leadership?
Well, it's ironic, really, because you know, from a cycling perspective, you would immediately move towards Northern Europe, where we have the Amsterdams, the Berlins, the Copenhagens of this world. But then you could conversely go to somewhere like China, which, you know, is a market where we sell bikes. I mean, it's coals to Newcastle and ice to Eskimo and bikes to China. But, you know, China is an interesting environment to observe when we are in a global crisis, because they have a different mechanism, which is, you could argue, the rights and wrongs of it in terms of they do not have a democracy.
Right.
But ironically, the speed at which they are adjusting and changing their cities in the times that I've been there in the last 18 years is breathtaking in terms of removing cars, introducing cycle lanes, and introducing active transport. So there are examples all over the world where other cities, other businesses, other political leaders have, you don't even need to guess it, because it's there. And you can take best practice, and it's not all in one place. And if you're prepared to look, you will find. And if you pick the best practice, you can apply it to your own environment. And no two cities are the same. Of course, they all have their own character, but their differences are way less than their similarities. So the common themes can be applied quickly. I mean, that's the killer. I mean, I'm here today in Glasgow, you know, pedaling about on my bike. I mean, I've seen more Mercedes taxis. I've seen more big people carriers. There's nobody on a bloody bicycle, you know, and we're at COP26. Now, of course, you know, you can always point the finger at, you know, because this isn't about that. It's about getting political movement and bringing people together. But somehow, sometimes innovation is right in front of you. You can't see it, and it's so obvious. And I think sometimes that's what I want to remind people of. The solutions are there.
And you emphasize leadership. We've got two examples of people in positions of leadership. Let me come first to Alexhines, Managing Director of Scotland's Railway. Thank you for having us. I said before that I would ask you what your fantasy railway for Scotland was. But first, let's stipulate, as they say in American courtrooms, that Will is right and that we all need to be riding a lot more bicycles. How do you connect up a kind of fixed, heavy, Victorian-built system with, how do you make it easy for people on bikes?
Yeah. So Will asked the question, where is the leadership? Well, a lot of the leadership is actually here in Scotland. So Scotland was one of the first countries in the world to declare a climate change crisis. We've got some of the toughest climate change targets, and we're going to decarbonise the railway here in Scotland by 2035. And the other thing we're doing is making it easier to travel by bike. So the world's most scenic railway journey starts here in Glasgow. It's on the West Highland Line. You can travel to Fort William. And we've launched our active travel cycle carriages where 20 bikes, all your mountaineering equipment, you can use it all year round to travel up the West Highland Line. And so we're not just about improving our railway, decarbonising our railway, but also making sure we connect in with other active travel modes and public transport. Most journeys in Scotland are less than 5 miles in distance. So they are absolutely ripe for conversion to active travel and public transport. So we're going to decarbonise our railway, and we're going to make it really easy to use. And you know, if you've travelled here by train, I hope you've had a great experience. And we've got ambitious plans to make it even better.
Just give us a headline figure for the amount of capital investment you'd need to decarbonise Scotland's railway right into the Highlands and Islands so that it looks like the Swiss one.
Well, the good news is we've decarbonised a lot of it already. So 75% of passenger journeys on Scotland's railway network are made on electric trains. And we buy our electricity from carbon zero sources. For freight, it's 45%. So actually, we've done most of it already. And we're working with the Scottish Government to make sure we drive down the cost of electrifying the railway. So we electrify railways more cheaply here in Scotland than other parts of the UK because we've done more of it, we've got good at it. And we're working with manufacturers of hydrogen trains and battery trains to decarbonise those bits of the network where we would never get the case to electrify.
But I'm just
go on, jump in
one
quickly.
little thing there. I mean, just one thing to remember, and I'm a massive fan of rail, and all these problems are not straightforward. But we need to remember, when we say carbon neutral, if we're being honest with ourselves, and it's the same with a bike, you have to make the thing. Yeah. You have to maintain the railway. You know, you have to change your stock. So we've got to be a bit careful. We're not carbon neutral yet. We've got to make the steel, and there isn't a steel industry that doesn't use a tremendous amount of carbon, and you need to change rail stock, you need to change the rail, your staff need to get there and move about. So we just got to be a bit careful. You know, you're doing a fantastic job, and we're making progress, but to really knock it out of the park, there's a lot more work to be done.
You're right to point out that carbon accounting is a bit, it's as flaky as accounting, isn't it? Yeah.
Shirley Rodriguez, can I come to you? You seem a long way over there. You are London's Deputy Mayor for the Environment and Energy. And London, apart from being a great city, which I call home, is also a huge laboratory for how you can use the powers of local government to change behaviour. And you've recently introduced the ULEZ, Ultra Low Emission Zone, and I got it completely wrong, the length of time that it had taken to get to this point. But tell us a bit about how long it did take, what's involved, because it's a heavy lift, isn't it?
It is a heavy lift, and rightly so, because it's quite an involved thing for people to change their behaviour, essentially. So you've got to give people warning that it's coming and time to get ready, alternatives that are put in place, and help for people who may need help. So the ultra low emission zone is, if people don't know, it is an emission zone in London. It started out in 2018 in the congestion charge area, which is a very small part of central London. Before that, we warned people it was coming and introduced a toxicity charge of £10 on journeys within that area, just again to remind people that it was coming. And it basically sets a standard that only vehicles of a certain standard, Euro 6 diesel, Euro 4 petrol, can drive in the centre. Otherwise, you'd have to pay £12.50. And that worked incredibly well, reduced air pollution emissions by around 50%, near enough 50%. We saw tens of thousands of vehicles no longer driving in the zone. And so you know, the reason we did it was because of air pollution, but partly because the space in London is very limited. So you sort of, in a sense, are rationing the space and making sure that the priority users are given that space. Because we are in London and many cities facing an air pollution crisis, you know, we have 4,000 Londoners dying prematurely every year from air pollution, you know, related to air pollution, illnesses related to air pollution. Many more are, you know, kids are growing up with stunted lungs and so on. The whole of London is not in compliance with the WHO health targets. And so Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, made it a priority to try and bring London back into legal compliance, which is not the WHO, which are tougher, but the legal compliance were formerly the EU standards. And one of the big tools to do that was the ultra low emission zone, which was setting that standard for that initially in the central London zone, and we've expanded it only 2 weeks ago, it feels a very long time ago now, on the 25th of October, to a zone now 18 times bigger than that size, out, if you know London, the north and south circulars. So it's a massive area. It brings in or covers 4 million people, and that's a lot of people with a lot of cars. But one of the things that we're asked about was, isn't this sort of penalising the poor? But 6 out of 10 households in that area do not own a car. The poorest people who are most affected by air pollution don't own a car. And so that we believe that that's going to reduce air pollution emissions by, you know, around a third, and there will be benefits across London. So that's why we do it. And your point about, you know, why does it take so long? Because you had to bring people along. We had to, as I said, tell people, but we had to enlist people. You can't do things to people. You have to sort of make the case. So we did a lot of work enlisting people and sort of telling them about the health evidence. We've got loads of amazing groups, you know, from Mums to Lungs to Choked Up to Rosamund Kissy-Deborah, who was on the stage at COP, talking about, you know, her daughter who died. It's the first person to have air pollution as a cause of death on her death certificate. You know, lots of campaigners from health professionals and so on, really pushing home the reason why we do this. And we've seen massive compliance, more than we thought. So about 87% of the vehicles driving now in that zone are compliant, you know, up from about 39% when we talked about introducing it in 2016, 2017. And
Shirley, of course, before this, another Labour mayor had introduced the congestion zone.
Yeah.
And then, as I recall, his Tory successor arriving by train in Glasgow just about now, I think, for his second slightly panicked visit, expanded it. But there was all hell broke loose in protest at the initial creation of the congestion zone. But is it fair to say that Londoners broadly now accept it as a good, in the same way as sort of in the States when they increase entitlements, people think, oh, well, yeah, we thought we were ideological about taxes, but we quite like the safety net?
People don't like change, but I think you've got to explain why the change is is being promoted, for health benefits. And I think often it's about, people talk about environmental things, but actually people want to know that their health of themselves and their loved ones are going to be protected, or their environment is going to be improved, or, we've seen in the pandemic, people didn't have access to green spaces, so that inequality is going to be addressed. And often things take time, people need to get used to it. So I think it is partly, and others have been talking about leadership, it is actually holding your nerve, continuing to make the case, getting people who will, not the usual suspects, to help make the case for you, people that people would trust, to say this is why it's a good thing. And often, as you say, it beds down. We're expecting rough rides. We did, Ken Livingstone on the congestion charge, and others. When Sadiq brought in the Central London Congestion Zone, we were expecting a lot of pushback. And yes, there has been a little bit, but not as much as people would expect. Partly because people recognise it's very hard to say, I want to carry on driving my car in London. I absolutely understand. We get these letters. I absolutely understand why, we need to do this from a health reason. It's terrible, but I want to drive my car. And then when people sort of see what they're saying, they sort of get it and, will change their behaviour, change their vehicle, use walking, cycling, public transport. And that's the big thing in London. We have a massive, extremely good public transport system. We want people to use it. We also want people to use the cycle lanes and car share clubs and so on. So as I said, that we keep that limited space really for those essential trips that you may need to do by car, but essentially about servicing London.
Thank you very much. Well, the one thing we haven't talked about in relation to London public transport is the tangible bits that move around, which brings me to Thomas Heatherwick, who probably needs no introduction, but just in case, for those of you who don't know, you are an artist as well as a designer, responsible for the B of the Bang and the redesigning of the Routemaster London bus. We were just talking about that, and without wishing to be too sycophantic, I thanked you for it, because it is such a blessing compared with a generation of London buses, in my view, that came between the original and the new one. Perhaps, we can come back to that if you like, but one of the reasons you're here is you've now designed a car. You're not a car designer, but you've designed a car. Tell us where it's going to be built and what it does and why it's different.
Okay, well first, representing design, I just wanted to say the design of this room is pretty amazing. Yeah. I've never spoken in a room with this feeling, and I've been enjoying the little midges, that were flying around you a bit earlier. I think they're like, it's amazing. I'm a cyclist first, and I'm also a public transport lover, and I think and a walking lover, and so I think all of these have a very powerful place in a city, and the choice between those all is so important. And I think the public transport's important to talk about, because I think for a long time London's Transport Authority saw it just about getting people from A to B, but not about the dignity of the passenger. And that's something that I got very interested in. Personally, one of the sides that I enjoy about public transport is the social side, because you see each other. And I remember someone saying a really good city is a city where rich people take public transport. That's the real test of whether a city is a good city. I suppose it's a really good test is whether they cycle as well, of course. We were asked, we worked on the London buses, and we were commissioned to design a car, and we've worked in China on a few projects and found certainly China in many ways was way ahead of the UK. The battery buses that we saw 11, 12 years ago in Shanghai, thousands of them, and the battery technology, the solar technology, very, very advanced. We are not primarily car focus, but this manufacturer is one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world. So we weighed up in the studio, what do we do? Every car manufacturer at the moment is falling over themselves after the incredible change, revolutionary change that Elon Musk made with the creation of Tesla, and an industry that was so entrenched and felt unchangeable to really turn it all upside down. But now every car manufacturer is falling over themselves to say, oh, we've got to make an electric car as well. And it felt like, are we going to just be a restyler of your version, or is there something more that could be added? And with this more than in London there are thousands of deaths, but in the world there are over 4 million deaths attributable to air pollution. And it felt that this sort of sense of the smug electric car driver driving around as if they're non-polluting at the point of driving, which isn't the case, when you've got a vehicle that's going around, as Will says, weighing the weight of many rugby players. Those tyres are dropping particles off them. The brake pads are giving particles off them. Those are running off into the water system if they're not getting into your child's lungs. And so we reflected on this and thought, well, there is an idea, and this isn't the most original idea we've had. We saw that in Southampton, the Go-Ahead, I think, were the bus operator who've been testing buses that have air extraction to take the particulate out. And the environmentalists, you may know, called Bill McDonough, the designer and architect, he had 30 years ago in his book, From Cradle to Cradle, had suggested, could a car clean the air? And so we put that down and put it to the manufacturers, because they were going to be making 1 million of these cars. And in the Chinese market, having 1 million of these things going around, what if they were scooping up, when they're in urban areas, some of that particulate? And it seemed that could be actively cleaning the air from the cars, buses, lorries and motorbikes pollution around, not just about the driver.
So just to be clear,
they said yes. So the exciting thing was we put that forward to them and they said yes. And the car will be coming out in 2024. There's a major scaling up. I don't believe that cars are the answer at all, but there is a role for the car within a transport system. And for example, my mother has a disability, and she wouldn't be able to get around if she didn't have a car. So our car also has double doors that slide open so that they're much more accessible than a conventional car. And so there are a whole lot of other ideas. But when we realized that they were up for that, that really engaged us, that there was something, I guess, that there's a push. A car has a lot of energy, carbon embodied in making it, but electric cars in the UK are 60% of the embodied carbon in their whole lifespan of a fossil fuel car. So it felt if we can contribute something to that as part of a transport mix, in no way a substitute for the amazing electric bike that I ride, that Will made, or the amazing buses or trains that are run. It's a part of a bigger thing, and we have a duty as a designer to try to make progress and take something that's going to happen anyway and make it something that's better if we can.
Right, well, I should say that I've seen pictures of this car. It's called the Aero. You may not have done, but it does something that, in addition to filtering the air, that other electric cars, particularly the Tesla, notwithstanding that you called it revolutionary, doesn't do, which is it completely reconfigures the car itself. And you can sit facing each other, for example. Why has it taken so long for people to take advantage of the opportunities?
I mean, I suppose from this talk, I focused on the air side, but the other side is that there are 1.4 billion cars in the world. And those 1.4 billion cars are only used 9% of the time, which is why the sharing and things like that seem so important. But that's so ridiculous. When you look, I mean, we design buildings a lot of the time. So we've been designing Google's headquarters with a company called BIG, and things in King's Cross and all sorts of things. And when you look with a real estate hat at any one moment, more than 1.2 billion cars a room. Most people's cars, the stereo in the car is better than the one in their house. Most people's cars, the chair is more comfortable than the one in their house. And then we've had a space crisis. So we've all been there in our bedrooms doing video conference calls, trying to pretend it's not our bedroom, to try and look half professional. And then you then think, well, there's all these spaces. So when thinking about the technology in aviation seats, where a seat is designed so that it's good for traveling, good for being entertained, good for eating, good for working, and even good for resting. Seeing, well, what if we thought of the seats in this as like the best aviation seat, so the driver's seat and the passenger seat can turn around, and a table fold out bigger than these two tables together, and it become a social space, a space you can work, not just when it's driving. So the steering wheel pushes in to the dash. It will have self-driving ability, but everyone always goes, oh, you mean while you're driving? So it could, but it's the dead cars sitting, filling streets, which are not either being driven and used to shed and moving around, nor being, and we've got this space crisis all over the world, so it seems, so that's the other side to that project. Which I wasn't sure that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just on the space crisis. So I don't know. We've seen this a lot across all the cities post, sort of during lockdown and now post-pandemic. Is the reclaiming of streets and the redesigning of streets. And I think the big push at the moment, and again it goes back to leadership and holding your nerve, is about those reclaimed streets for walking and cycling, for social activities, for eating out, you know, even in the cold weather in Scotland or London, is really how do we keep that? And you know, what Thomas is talking about in terms of design and will is absolutely about what we're talking about and how do we redesign our cities, both for the way we want to live now and in the future, but also to be resilient to the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. We've seen flash flooding in London, you know, not as bad as in say, New York or in some of the other countries in Germany and so on. But these are big design issues that we're having to grapple with. And we have in London a London plan that tries to do that. We have a policy about air quality positive. How do we make our developments, when they go in, actually contribute to improving our air, not just mitigating the air pollution it causes, but how do you improve it? So those are the sorts of concepts that I think that we need to really bring to both sustainable transport, but, you know, that city redesign.
Yeah, just a second. I do want to give all of you a chance to have one more bite at the cherry before we go to questions, but slightly peering into crystal balls, please. I want to hear one fantasy that you have for personal mobility looking 5 or 10 years ahead. Antonina, I want to start with you. You mentioned in a previous conversation that you hoped, well, tell us about your vision for car ownership.
Sure, yeah. So I'm part of Generation Climate of the New York Times as well. So I've been meeting a lot of young people here, and a lot of other young people, peers that I have, want to live with a culture of sufficiency, not of excess, not of consumerism. And I think we're all on the same page on car ownership, that can decline almost to nothing, especially in cities. And in other cases, when you need a car, of course, there are reasons to have one. But I think the majority of us probably could live well without one if we have the alternatives available and if we have cities well designed.
Would you have like a subscription to a transport service?
Yeah, so actually this is a personal story, but my older sister has 2 kids and she lives without a car in Ottawa, Canada, and she rents a car when she needs one. Like, we don't even need a new sharing technology. We already have the ability to rent cars. So yeah, it can be quite simple. And just to touch on aviation, the real target, too, of cultural change and of consumer preference change that we need to see is in the wealthiest people, the private jets and the frequent flyers. And we need frequent flyer levies to be taxing progressively. The more you fly, the more you pay, to redistribute who gets to fly and who gets to travel internationally.
Okay, thank you. Will, whatever you were going to say, plus your fantasy for personal mobility 5 or 10 years hence?
Funny enough, I'm going to say what I was going to say just because I can't resist it. And it's sort of a teeny weeny bit encapsulates your question, which is if you went and asked a chimpanzee in the zoo that was born in the zoo and swung around in its cage, if it was happy, it would say it's very happy. It's lived in the zoo. It was born in the zoo. Occasionally some child gives it a little sweetie. It gets the odd banana. It's happy as hell. But then you let the chimpanzee out of its cage and it swings around in something like this for 2 or 3 months, which is what happened in lockdown. The whole world had an experience of something completely different as a result of tragedy, but something completely different. Then you take the chimpanzee and you shove it back in its cage and you say, "You happy in there?" He said, "Hell no, this sucks. I want to go back to where I was." And my fantasy is that we've take this terrible experience we've been through as a globe and hold on to what positives came out of it. Hold on to it, because you need leadership at the top, but you need people to not accept what is unacceptable. And now we've seen what's possible, we need to hold on to it. And people need to be prepared to stand up and say, "I don't want that. I don't want that for my children. I don't want that for how I live. This needs to change." And it's possible because we've seen it. So for me, it's not about miraculous inventions, as we've talked about. So much of the solution exists. Innovation will come because we love innovating, particularly engineers like me.
Yeah.
But I'm not worried about the innovation. It's the application of what is there.
I've invited you to fantasize, and I will come back to you, but I'm very conscious the clock is ticking down. Can we have, are there any questions from people out here? Yes, the 4 rows back near the aisle. Do you have a microphone?
Hi, it's Phoebe. Hi, Giles.
Oh, hi.
So I'm cheating a little bit because Giles is my editor, but it's a question I have because I think Reclaim These Streets came up, and I think we've had quite an intersectional conversation. Disability, we're talking about coronavirus, but what about gender? So, I know as a woman in London, I'd quite like to use public transport a bit more. I'd like to use the night tube. Instead, I'm kind of forced to not. And I'd like to use, get around, I like to walk around at night, and that doesn't feel like a possibility. How can we have a conversation, use that narrative to kind of improve these cities, improve them for women, improve them for children, and improve them for people who have mobility issues?
Shirley.
Well, that's absolutely key to not just London, but to every city. This isn't just a London issue. It is about, violence against women and making sure that all people feel that they're able to use the transport network and the cities they wish. So back to design, it's partly how you build design cities to design out crime and fear of crime often, making sure the services are available, so the night tube is coming back. It's partly been hit big, because of the sort of pandemic and sort of getting London and other cities, as I said, back to sort of the good parts of what was happening before. We do want to keep those things that were good, carrying on and improve on them.
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, gender equality, gender balance is absolutely critical. There's that terrible story which says if you're female, you're more likely to have a fatal injury in a car accident because most crash test dummies are men. And therefore, one of the ways we can tackle this problem is by having more women in our workforce. Only 20% of my team are female. And last time I checked, half the population was female. And so if we have more women in our workforce, we'll be able to design better products and services for the entire population. And so a big part of our agenda here in Scotland is Scotland's railways for everybody, no matter who you are, your sexuality, your sex, etc. And designing a railway which is for everyone is a big part of our agenda.
Thank you. I think I saw a hand there, yeah.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether governments are doing enough to change the way people move. So whilst Rishi Sunak is halving taxes on domestic flights, you've got governments in France, Netherlands and Austria who are phasing out domestic flights on routes where trains can get travellers to the same place in under 2.5 hours.
Well, I'm sure, Shirley, you have a response to that, and we'll come to you. Anybody else want to tackle that first from a non-political perspective?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the Prime Minister arrived by train today on time from London, and there was a bit of commentary, wasn't there, on his first visit to Glasgow. So I think public pressure here is important. I think the other thing is, Scotland is one of the first countries in the world to commit to a reduction in car use. which is some of that brave leadership which we talked about, which, as you said, might feel a bit scary at the start, but actually, when we set an ambitious target like that, like decarbonising the railway in Scotland by 2035, guess what? Often, miraculously, it will happen because we focus people on an ambitious target.
I do want to hear from Shirley in response to the question, hypocrisy or not?
Well, look, you know, the fact that you reduce a flight duty on a service that is 3 times as much coming up to Scotland, I think is ridiculous. It sends really bad signals. But, you know, but to give the government credit, you know, they've got some very good statements like the one that you talked about today, you know, phasing out ICE vehicles by 2030, the 2040 for big trucks. I think what we want to see is action now and you know, how do those things actually get delivered? And I think one of the things that, you know, that Sadiq has asked about, but many of the other mayors in the C40 are about, you know, how are you putting your plans into action? And I think the proof is in the pudding. It's are you delivering? And, you know, some of the things that we've been talking with lots of other mayors, you know, last week and many of the mayors when we have the Cities and Built Environment Day tomorrow will be about the actions the cities are taking. And we know, we've heard already, these are big centres of emissions productions and consumption, and they're areas where, you know, citizens want their mayors to go further. The thing I would say to governments is give mayors and city leaders, local government leaders the powers and the finance to get on and do what citizens are asking them to do, particularly on climate change.
Thank you. I would love to hear your fantasy for personal mobility beyond the pollution-eating car. Can we do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, shoot.
Okay, I was just going to say something I think is really important to say is that the joy of travelling, we need to talk about that, not just about the carbon involved and speed of A to B, but the absolute joy. Think of some of the best experiences of our lives are travelling. And my experience is that unless you're designing for joy, you're not making anything sustainable. And I love that one of the joyous experiences was coming on the sleeper train. I can't believe they exist. Where are they during the day? They're like a ghost. What happens?
We're cleaning them.
It was magical, trundling through the night. You never forget that feeling of joy. Transport, whether it's on a bicycle, if we talk about transport, it's important to talk about the city. Walking is a wonderful thing to do, amazing. When you're walking through an interesting city, there's been a disaster in city making over the last 80 years. Most new buildings are the most sterile, rubbish thing to walk past. You want to drive past them. You want to go fast past them because they don't hold your interest. They're not engaging and human. So underneath all of this is the absolute, we must never forget that joy is key, in whatever thing. And our cities needs to keep being joyous and not just think, right, how do we get from there and persuade people to walk? People are easily persuaded when joy is there. And I know I sound like a sentimental kind of guy on this panel now, but it's so true.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Will, I'm sorry we couldn't come to you, and I don't know how strict the clock is, but I suspect it's fairly strict. Shirley, Alex, Thomas, Antonina, and Will, thank you so much for joining us. I think we have spoken too little of joy and too much of technocracy, but thank you very much.